Good afternoon. And welcome everyone to this third meeting of the Joint Subcommittee on Elementary and Secondary Education Funding. At our last meeting, staff and JLARC provided further information on the near-term recommendations from the JLARC funding formula report. Staff also reviewed the Joint Subcommittee's work plan, recommended actions for consideration during the upcoming 2025 session, and discussed the interim report the Joint Subcommittee produced as part of its charge. As a note, this report was posted on the LIS reports page and was sent to members after the last meeting. Today, we will focus on further refinement of potential options for the 2025 session based on presentations provided by the Virginia Department of Education and by staff. In addition, we will hear from our colleagues from the National Conference of State Legislators about successful funding reform processes in other states to help us think about how we can structure our work in the 2025 interim. Delegate Rasul, do you have anything you would like to add as Vice Chair other than cutting me off?
Way to go. Thank you.
That's not.
No, I think this is. Thank you, Madam Chair. Definitely the last thing we want to do is cut you off. I appreciate that. Thank you. And one other area I'd like to mention, Madam Chair, is that we have a public comment period. We've invited, under Madam Chair's leadership, have encouraged public comment both before and after every one of our meetings. And so we currently have a form online which opened up last week and will remain open through December 13th. We take that very seriously, and we will also have time at the end of our agenda today to hear from members of the public.
Thank you, Delegate Rasul. And if there are no other comments, I will now turn it over to Anya Pfeiffer on our staff to provide some additional comments before we welcome our speakers.
Just going to run through a quick reminder of the Joint Subcommittee's mandate and then the agenda for today. So as a reminder, our purpose with the Joint Subcommittee is to provide ongoing oversight on the standards of quality and make recommendations. And the task specifically before the Joint Subcommittee is to review the JLARC recommendations related to the 2023 K-12 funding formula report and propose appropriate amendments in a long-range plan. And as Senator Locke just mentioned, the initial report was submitted on November 1st. And just to recap those initial recommendations, to refresh everybody's memory, at the October 31st meeting, you all approved the following recommendations, and we noted that this meeting would consider some additional refinements for those recommendations. The first was to prioritize the remaining near-term JLARC recommendations. Some considerations we wanted to highlight here are reviewing the updated cost information from the Department of Education, which we'll hear today, and consider how each impacts the criteria laid out last meeting of scalability, data availability, and proportionate distribution. The second recommendation was to explore options to further support special education. Considerations here are reviewing public comment and special education policies and our funding methodology. And the final initial recommendation was to address the data and infrastructure needs to support the Joint Subcommittee. And some refinement considerations here are receiving additional input from national experts and reviewing reform processes in other states. So that's just kind of a level set before we head into the presentations today. And then Senator Locke ran through this briefly, but just so we see where we're going today, we have our cost updates from the Department of Education, and then a discussion of special education near-term strategies, overview of K-12 funding reform in other states, and then we'll wrap up with our next steps and public comment. And Madam Chair, that is all I have for this first part of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Anya. Now we'll ask Christina Berta from the Department of Education to present cost updates for the JLARC near-term recommendations. Mrs. Berta, thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the Joint Subcommittee. I am a new face to Virginia Department of Education, so I will take a brief moment to tell you who I am. I am Christina Berta, the new Chief Operating Officer for the Virginia Department of Ed, replacing Kent Dickey, a familiar face to you. So Kent has retired and I have some big shoes to fill. So happy to be before you this morning or this afternoon to share with you the JLARC short-term, near-term recommendations and cost updates from us. So if we can jump into the presentation, thank you. So the first one recommended by JLARC was recommendation 1, and it had to do with consideration of changing the Code of Virginia and to include language to make technical updates related to the standards of quality with 4 components. 1 being including all division central office positions in the SOQ formula, applying the cost to compete adjustment to facility and transportation salaries inside of the SOQ formula, to remove the cap and adjust non-personnel cost assumptions inside of the formula, and then also to account for the cost of facilities, staff salaries, and compensation supplement calculations, excuse me. So we are able to tell you today that looking at item 3 out of that 4 would cost an average of $30.5 million additional annual dollars to accommodate the removal of the cap for non-personnel cost assumptions. Items 1, 2, and 4 would require some additional work from our staff to program and test those changes. We currently do not have a data collection to calculate facility and transportation salary cost. That is not part of the SOQ component at this time in that detail. So we would certainly need additional time in order to accomplish numbers 1, 2, and 4. Looking at the JLARC recommendation number 4, the General Assembly may wish to consider including language in the Appropriation Act to change the standards of quality formula to do 3 things. 1, eliminate the support cap. 2, reinstate the non-personnel categories that were removed in fiscal year 2009 and 10, and reinstate the federal deduction methodology that was used prior to fiscal year 09. We have evaluated, and again, there's 2 components. For the number 1, the elimination of the support cap, we have calculated that to cost approximately $200 million per year. Items 2 and 3, again, would require us to update, program, and test the older funding mechanics inside of the SOQ model. We would have to calculate both of those separately and then compare back for reasonableness in order to give you an estimated cost for those items. Looking at JLARC recommendation number 6, the General Assembly may wish to include language in the Appropriation Act directing VDOE to calculate salaries and other standards of quality formula cost assumptions using a division average rather than a linear weighted average that is currently used. We do not have a cost estimate for that, and we would have to reprogram the SOQ model in its entirety. We estimate that we would have to need about 1 month in order to adjust that to an average salary versus a linear weighted average. Moving ahead to JLARC recommendation number 7, the General Assembly may wish to amend the Code of Virginia, including language in the Appropriation Act, to change the local composite index to be calculated using a 3-year average with the most recently available data rather than a single year every other year. We estimate that the cost impact to do that in the initial year would be $6.5 million per year. The ongoing effects would vary widely from biennium to biennium, which is the case today. And the best assumption in the long term would be that there would be no additional fiscal impact beyond the $6.5 million. I think the important part for us is that our estimate that we currently are giving you is based on 2019, 2020, and 2021 data from Weldon Cooper and the Department of Tax. And those, we don't have the ability to get from them more current data. So when we do the update for the 26 to 28 biennium, that will be based on 21, 22, and 23 data. So we are a little delayed in that process due to the timing of the availability of the data from those 2 sources. And that is typical. I don't want you to think that's just because of this JLARC recommendation. That is a typical thing each year. Recommendation number 8, the General Assembly may wish to consider amending the Code of Virginia and Appropriation Act to designate an at-risk add-on program as part of the SOQ funding model in recognition that the funding is essential for K-12. We estimate that there is no impact to make this change fiscally. Recommendation number 9, the General Assembly may wish to consider amending the Code of Virginia and include language in the Appropriation Act to direct use of federally approved identified student percentage, or ISP, to measure calculated funding for all at-risk programs that currently rely on the outdated free lunch estimates. We have been able to provide you with 2 updates, one being algebra readiness to move from the free lunch metric to an ISP times 1.25 would cost about $4.9 million annually to make that change. Looking at the Virginia Preschool Initiative to make that same change from free lunch to ISP times 1.25 would be $34.6 million. And then we are unable at this time to change the K-3 primary class size reduction tiers because we would need to know what those new funding ranges are, and that would take us some time to calculate. Recommendation number 11, the General Assembly may wish to consider to include language in the Appropriation Act requiring the Virginia Department of Education to work with school division staff and experts to develop a new special education needs estimate based on a review of the current one, and then report its findings to the Board of Ed, House Committee on Education, and Senate Committee on Education and Health. We have worked with your wonderful staff to identify some possible options. I know that is the topic of your next agenda item, and we will be able to answer any questions should you have some. That is the end of our formal presentation. Madam Chair, I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Are there any questions, Delegate Rasul?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question going back to recommendation 9. On recommendation 9, the additional $34.6 million, is that in addition? So in the budget, we already made a sizable investment here. So my question is that are these combined approximately $40 million in addition to what we've already done, or just accounting for some of that already?
That is correct. It's an addition. We use Chapter 2 as our base to calculate the estimates for this presentation.
Thank you.
Does that complete your question?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Delegate
Thank you.
Bolivar?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I guess for the ones that you were able to come up with a definitive cost impact, that's extraordinarily helpful as we go into the 25 session. For the ones where it says you need a month of additional analysis or some other level of analysis, do you have a sense of whether that's something that DOE could do if requested using current funds, or would you require a budget amendment in order to be able to implement some of those, or at least get the information necessary for us to be able to reasonably understand the cost impacts?
Thank you, Delegate Bolivar. Madam Chair, I believe it would depend on what type of ask you had of our staff. If it is a simple change to what's already existing in the model, we could probably accommodate that. If it requires some more technical things in nature that are outside of the funding model, we may likely need additional support by way of staff or an expert to handle something that may be more technical in nature.
Okay, Madam Chair, follow up. Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess, from my perspective, to the degree that, all of the short-term recommendations at least should be discussed on their merits and their potential cost benefits, it might be worthwhile for, this joint subcommittee to request that some kind of budget amendment be put in place or be drawn up so that we can get the sense of the timing and the cost of being able to get that information, so we could do that during the 2025 session and not miss a window of opportunity to be able to start generating that data.
Other questions? If not, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate your presentation. Now Wendy King from our staff will present some additional staff analysis on the near-term JLARC recommendations based on criteria outlined in the Joint Subcommittee's November 1st report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as Anya mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we talked at the last meeting about if we received the cost estimates, how would we be able to prioritize some of these and be able to think about ways if we move forward to the 2025 session to do that. So we thought of 3 criteria. One is scalability, meaning if we had limited amounts of dollars, could we scale it or incrementally implement it? The data availability was another factor, and we heard from DOE, I'm going to walk through that in a minute, about which one of these have some readily available data. And then there's also the last one, which was proportionate distribution. Would we have localities that gain from this change and localities that don't gain, and would that be something that members would want to consider in case there were a hold harmless for that? So these are 3 criteria we mentioned. So what I'm going to do in these next 2 slides is you just heard from DOE about those recommendations, and they talked about some of them had some available data, some did not, and then also they talked about the cost for it. So we've applied a lens through that, and that's what I'll walk through very quickly here. So the recommendations that are the near-term ones, so they'll see there's 1 and then it jumps to 4. That's because 2 and 3 were long-term ones. So just as a note on that area. But in area 1, as Christina just mentioned, the one area that they could do that is 1I, which was to remove the cap on inflation, which is in the middle row there. And we found that that is something that could be scalable. There is data available, and they have a cost estimate of $30.5 million. One note that we've added to this is while JLARC did provide this recommendation, by moving away from the moving on the cap of an inflation, this is something that we also apply in VRS. We have a similar cap to it. So something we wanted to flag here is if we do that in the K-12 area, that might be starting to move away from a precedent we've set on VRS that has an inflation adjustment cap too. So that's something that we wanted to note is, yes, it does meet these 3 criteria, but VRS currently has a cap that's similar to this. So if we make the change here, we might be setting a precedent to do that for VRS. Moving down, there were some other ones that Christina had provided that for number 4, 1.4 does not have it. Moving into 4, these are the Great Recession era costs, and you've often heard from people about the elimination of the support cap. And that current cost estimate to further lift that, right now I think we're at 24 individuals to 1,000, and to fully lift it is close to 27.7. So the full cost to do that is $200 million. But again, this is one that we have done incrementally in the past. We've gone from 24 to 25. So there are some potentials to be able to look at that on an incremental basis like we've done in the past. We do have the data available, and that could provide a proportionate distribution to everybody to implement that. So there's some opportunity during the 2025 session to consider that. Moving on to the next ones that Christina had presented. The next one that they did have data before for us was the LCI moving to a 3-year average. It is scalable, and there is, it's not scalable. It's either you're going to implement the 3-year average or you would not. There is data available. However, if we do that, we're going to have about 54 divisions that would get an increase, but 76 divisions would have a decrease on that implementation. So again, applying that lens that we had, that would be a consideration for members. The total cost on that was about $6.5 million. In the next one that she also provided a number for, which is the free and reduced price measure moving to something called ISP. As the question was asked earlier, the biggest one that we made the change on last session was the at-risk funding, and that was the biggest funding amount. But there are a handful of other smaller programs that JLARC had identified, including algebra readiness, we have not moved those over. So, ideally, we would want to move all of them at one point over to that amount. But the one that they did give us an estimate on is for algebra readiness. It's about $4.9 million. It does not have a proportionate distribution, and it is not scalable. It is a smaller number. I think we had about 3 school divisions that would have a lower amount, and then the rest of the school divisions would benefit from that. So again, part of this was to walk through kind of that lens of how you could consider recommendations moving forward. At the end of walking through the special needs, we'll be able to kind of pull all these different concepts together for you to continue to consider recommendations and further refinements for the 2025 session. But I'll stop there and answer any questions based on what we had applied for that matrix.
Are there any questions? Delegate Rasul.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question on the LCI 3-year. Do we have or maybe we can look into, I wonder what it might cost for a 1-year hold harmless if we considered that. And so as we move forward. So we might not have that number off the top of your head, but if we don't, maybe that could be a thought just in case the will of the legislature is to potentially advance that if it's got a really big number, since there are so many school divisions that stand to lose from making that permanent shift there. Thank you.
Madam Chair, and as a delegate, we can certainly look into what the hold harmless would look like for that. We also note there is other LCI long-term recommendations they had. So one thing we've also been cautious of, if we're going to look at it, would we want to do one change after we talk about everything, or do we want to do an incremental? But that's something we could follow up with you on.
Delegate Bolivar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to go back to recommendation 1, little Romanet 3, so remove the cap on inflation adjustments, and understand your point about potentially misaligning with other areas such as how we deal with COLA. I guess I was hoping you might be able to talk a little bit about the background of that and what the unintended consequences may be of having that cap. And I guess my concern is by having that cap, particularly in times when we have higher inflation, it's certainly going to save the state some money, but you've got actual VRS, people who rely on their VRS payments where they're not going to be able to keep up with the pace of inflation, and it's actually going to wind up eroding the purchasing power of their dollar. So anyways, I guess notwithstanding the misalignment, I'm just wondering if whether that's a good policy or not, or what kind of the background of that was.
Madam Chair, Delegate Bolivar, I think I'd have to check with our staff in terms of that, because it may have been the VRS cap was put in place during the same time that the VRS one, the K-12 one was here. But Zach, you might have some additional information.
I am not familiar with the genesis of the VRS cap. I understand that it already existed, and then it was later applied to the assumptions for K-12 during the rebenchmarking process. One thing that I would note is that inflation cap is what is used to advance costs that are reported. Like currently, our K-12 costs are based on FY22, and we use inflation projections to advance that to the current biennium. The next biennium, the actual costs would get picked up. So eventually, those inflation costs do roll into the actual inflation costs do roll into the K-12 formula. So you could look at the inflation cap as sort of a temporary measure. So it's sort of during a 2-year period where it's capped, and then 2 years later, when we recognize those costs in our formula, they're picked up.
Any other questions of Wendy? Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, we'll now have Zach Robbins from our staff present near-term strategies for special education. In addition, we have staff with expertise in special education from the Department of Education present to assist members with any subject matter specific questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee. To remind you of some recent actions in JLARC reports, in the 2023 report, which is why we're all here today, it was found that only 15% of special education aides that are employed by school divisions are supported through the SOQ funding formula. It's about 1,700 positions are state supported, while about 15,800 are actually employed. And that's FY23 data. The report also found that the current special education formula is overly complex, and they recommended a longer-term review of special education staffing standards. And the report also included a potential option for moving to a student-based formula with respect to special ed. JLARC also released a 2020 report on special education. While that report was not focused on funding, it did include an analysis of state, federal, and local contributions to special education as of FY19. And it found that in that year, localities supported 69% of the cost of special education, with the federal and state government picking up the rest. And for comparison, in that same year, looking at the total cost of K-12 education, localities contributed 51%. So the disparity is 51% local support when you're looking at the total K-12 system. If you're just looking at special ed, localities are picking up about 69% of the cost. During the last General Assembly session, two other special populations that were identified in the JLARC report as needing additional support received additional funding. In FY 2025, at-risk funding increased by about $185 million a year, and funding for English learners increased by about $35 million a year. And at your last meeting, staff was requested to review ways to increase support for the special education population in the near term. So a little bit of background on special education. To be considered a special education student, one must have educational or physical disabilities, and they must receive special education services that are prescribed through an individualized education plan or an IEP. That population is about 15% of Virginia students, about 185,000 students. And within this population, there's a wide variation of need, with a much smaller number of students requiring more intensive services that cost considerably more per student. Currently, the only readily available data demonstrating student need within this group focuses on two tiers of services that are provided, and they're already incorporated into our existing student funding formula. Level 1 services, these are services that are provided for less than a school day, for example, a few hours of speech therapy, and all special education students are considered within that category. Level 2 services, these are more intense services that are provided for more than half of a school day. This is a much smaller subset. It's about 40,000 students. It represents about 3 to 4% of the overall student population. Special education SOQ funding, it currently provides the state share of funding for teacher and instructional aid positions. It's using an intricate formula that takes into account student enrollment, but also maximum caseloads for special education teachers based on the level 1 and level 2 service distinctions. And these caseloads generally provide a maximum per teacher caseload of 24 per level 1 students, and 6 to 8 is the caseload for your level 2 services. However, there is provision made for higher caseloads when an instructional aid is provided. These caseloads have not been substantially updated for 25 years at least. During this period, a major shift in practice has been towards inclusionary practices, resulting in more special education students enrolled in general ed classrooms. So that may have driven some need for additional aids in practice. In the current fiscal year, this formula results in about 63% additional funding on top of the basic aid per special education student. However, the percent of that add-on varies from division to division. So that special education funding, that additional 63%, it totals about $525 million for FY26. The federal government also contributes a significant amount, about $300 million a year, through IDEA Part B Section 611 funding. This provides general support for school divisions for special ed students, similar to the state SOQ funds. There are also two substantial pots of funding for a very small number of students that have very intense needs. The Department of Education administers what's known under an acronym as SISNA, which stands for Students with Intensive Support Needs. These funds provide about $99 million in FY26, And these funds offset the cost for students with the most intense service needs. And this was previously known as a regional special education tuition funding. However, this program was converted a few years ago into this new CISNA program design. The Office of Children's Services also administers about $375 million in CSA funds, Children's Services Act funds, for students whose IEP placement is in a private day school under contract with the local school division. So as I mentioned earlier, JLARC suggested some longer-term actions to address special education funding, including a study on special ed staffing standards. So while this could result in more targeted funding, it would take additional time for study and data collection for us to get there. In the near term, one option that would be available to the subcommittee would be to establish an add-on to basic aid for each special education student. And you would use that level of service as a means to further supplement those more intense service needs. And the staff worked with the Department of Education to scope out the cost of each 1% of an add-on for level 1 and level 2 students. And the fiscal impact of a 1% add-on for level 1 would be $8.7 million for FY26, and for level 2 services would be $1.8 million. Now, the intent here would be to select a higher percentage add-on for those level 2 services that are more intense, recognizing those additional costs for those services. So if this interim add-on were implemented, keep in mind that the longer-term actions that may come forward on special education could be more targeted. So too much additional funding could drive the demand for hold harmless funding in the future if you end up amending that formula in the near future. However, there is a large gap between the local contribution before you would potentially create those conflicts that would drive the need for hold harmless. So this summarizes our proposal for a special education add-on, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Are there any questions to Zach? Delegate Sewell?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Zach, could you remind us how much we think the projected cost is per student with disabilities, and then how much the state is providing per student? We had talked about some number. It gives us a feeling for the disparity there per student.
On a per student basis, I would have to go back to that FY19 data unless the department has something more current, perhaps with their data collections to represent more recent fiscal years.
Thank you.
Delegate Bulova?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And realizing that this needs to be heavily caveated, Zach, I guess you had called out that you didn't want to increase services for special education too high, because then, like you were saying, we'd have to potentially do hold harmless if we're going to look at the formula and make it a little less complicated. Do you have an order of magnitude in mind about where that threshold would be in terms of either percentage or monetary amount?
I would defer back to the pie chart that showed the 69% gap. So that was the intent was to give you some caution, but I think it would be a very large amount of money to where you would create those conflicts that could drive the need for hold harmless.
Madam Chair, I assume more than we would be able to absorb in a 2025 session then, so
I think that would be safe to
okay,
assume.
thank you.
Senator Boysko?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you're discussing what we could do to increase capacity for our special ed students, we're not talking at all about the shortage of teachers in this discussion, right? That's not part of this, but we have to recognize that we
Correct.
don't have enough teachers.
These would be additional funds to generally support special ed. You know, local school divisions could make some decisions with those additional funds to perhaps address compensation or some other recruitment needs to address the shortage in their area.
So, Madam Chair, just follow up. So would a locality who receives these additional funds, if this is the direction we decide to go, they could make some decisions on their own about how those funds are used towards helping their special ed population? Is that
Yes, so these
the
funds would be,
concept is?
they would be restricted to special education. However, there would not be specifics as far as, you need to hire a number of additional staff.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Rasul.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just looking at that graph you mentioned on page 10, it looks as though, from an equity perspective, if we are having the localities pay 51% of the average student, that gap is about $460 million that localities are paying more from a percentage perspective. So it is a sizable gap.
It is substantial, yes.
Thank you.
Other questions? Senator Obenshain?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm curious as to, I think the department is here, and I'm curious as to what they think would be the utility of, or the best way to approach this. It seems to me that these needs are highly individualized, and it's very difficult to peg the financial needs of any particular child, and that makes it very difficult to use the the teacher to student ratios, and this is a new world to me, but I'm curious as to whether they've had an opportunity to weigh in, or whether, Madam Chair, you'd be willing to hear from the specialists from the special ed division of the Department of Education.
Certainly.
Good afternoon. Sam Hollins. I'm the Director of Special Populations at the Virginia Department of Education. And Senator, you're correct. We are in constant communication with local school divisions, and what is being proposed today would be additional funding to support students on a need-based level. And so those supports could include staffing, as been previously mentioned, but also additional resources that would be incredibly important, irregardless of where a student sits and the services and supports that they receive throughout the school day. So I would be hopeful that the feedback you all receive from local school divisions is the same that we've heard, that any additional support could be utilized in both staffing in excess, different than the caseload requirements. Those are caseload requirements. Staffing really unpacks very differently within the classroom environment. And so these funds to support that work would be incredibly useful and be able to be utilized immediately.
Madam Chair, follow-up question. Is there disproportionate impact that this has on school divisions in terms of size? For example, a small school division with a disproportionately high population of students with significant special ed needs, it would seem in that small school division, they're going to be significantly, the impact is going to be disproportionately great on them as compared to a very large school division.
Madam Chair and Senator, I think the committee staff did a great job of putting forth a proportionate response that, because it's a per pupil add-on, it would be able to be benefited by the student populations that are being served at the division level. And so these funds would be allocated based on the number of students that they're serving, and that would be incredibly valuable. And you saw that there are other opportunities through both state and federal funds to support students with different and more intensive needs, and this would simply join a concert of that ability.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? If not, thank you, Don. Okay, now we'll have Mike Griffith with NCSL and the Learning Policy Institute present on K-12 funding reform processes in other states. He will be joining us virtually. If you will recall, from the Joint Subcommittee's first meeting, Mr. Griffith was with us then, and he has extensive experience working with states on their K-12 funding formulas. So we're pleased to have him back. So thank you, Mr. Griffith, for joining us today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm unable to see the PowerPoint right now. Or am I supposed to share it from my screen? Oh, there we go. Great. Thank you. So my name is Michael Griffith. I'm a senior researcher and policy analyst with the Learning Policy Institute. We have been working with our friends at the National Conference of State Legislatures on a lot of this work. And so I want to call out Dan Thatcher, who might also be on this call, who's worked with us on this. And today I've been asked to talk about school funding transition processes. And if we could go to the next slide, please. It's just a little overview about what we're going to talk today. And to give you a quick understanding of who we are, the Learning Policy Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that specializes in education policy research. My specific field is in school funding. And so I go around the country really and work with different states on their funding formulas. So what we want to talk today about some of that work that we've done, some of the things that we've seen happening in different states. So we're going to start by talking about some states that have adopted new formulas fairly recently. Then we're going to focus in on those that used a commission to help them come to that conclusion and come up with a new formula. And then we're going to talk about some of the issues around forming those commissions and setting their goals and setting their standards. So we could go to the next slide, please. So here's a list of the states that have adopted brand new funding formulas since 2000. And I should have also included Mississippi on this. Mississippi just recently passed a brand new formula. But we talked about this the last time I presented. The thing that is different here is I've highlighted the states in green that had commissions that specifically were in charge of drawing up a new formula and helping to get it passed. But you can see here we've highlighted in green Illinois, Maryland, and Tennessee. But then these other states, the way that they passed their formulas was a little different. In some cases, it simply was done through the traditional legislative process. In other cases, it was a sort of, I hate to say behind closed doors, but behind closed doors type of meeting between the governor's office and the legislature. And they did not rely necessarily on an open public meeting. So if we can go to the next slide. I wanted to start by talking, before I show you some of these other states and what they did and how they did it, some of the keys to success when you have a commission that we found. First off is having clear goals. And each of these I'm going to talk about in more detail, but I think it's good to start with them. So you want to have clear goals about what are you going to change and how are you going to change it. You want to have a clear understanding of what are the powers and the responsibilities of the commission. You want to talk about the time frame too. The bigger the change, the longer time you're going to need. And then the size of membership. And again, we'll talk about each of these more importantly. And then the one thing we did find, and you find this for those states that had commissions or didn't have commissions, one of the big keys to success is having a champion or champions guiding the process. In all honesty, more often than not, this is the governor. But it also can be legislators or it can be a group of people. And we'll talk about those in the states I'm going to show you as examples in a few seconds. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So here are the commissions we want to talk about. We have Illinois, Maryland had two different ones in 99 and 2016, and then Tennessee in 2021. And I want to also talk about Delaware. They haven't been successful yet because the commission just started about 4 months ago. But talk about where they're at in, working with Delaware now and then talking to people in your state. I feel like Delaware is about a year ahead of you in the process, so you may be able to learn some lessons there. You can see the membership of each of these commissions. You can see the names there. I don't think the names are necessarily that important, but if you wanted to look up more about them, you can take a look there. But you can see that the memberships tend to be a break of both legislators and then governor appointees, and in some of these, educational advocates were included too. If we can go to the next slide, please. So you can see here that in each of these, the time frame ranged that they're around from 1 year to 18 months. There's a lot going into that because, for instance, in Illinois, it was only, in Tennessee, it was only a year long, But in each of those cases, there was a lot of groundwork that was laid beforehand. So Illinois had another commission that also was in place for about a year. They brought in a lot of people from around the state. They made visits to school districts from north to south in their state, took in a lot of input, and came up with a set of recommendations. Because that happened during the economic downturn, those recommendations just weren't able to move forward. So then the second Illinois Commission was able to build off the first and kind of use a lot of their work as a starting point. Then in then in the Tennessee case, it was something that they again had been working on for years, and then had decided that they would take a lot of the work that had been done previously and just kind of move that forward with the commission. So the commission was sort of given a list of this is what we think the formula should look like. They didn't have to start from scratch. In both Maryland, the two Maryland cases, they were very long processes. Usually, in both cases, the first year or so, was simply studying the system, and then the second half was taking those the information they received from the study and kind of moving forward on it. Then showing was it successful? Yes, in each one of these cases, it was, with the exception of Delaware, which is still in process. And then another point is each of them worked with some outside consultant group to either work with them on a pretty much daily basis in the case of both the Maryland studies, or more as sort of overview advisors like in Illinois and Tennessee. It really does help. It helps to have an extra voice. How much they're involved really depends on you and how much additional information you want about sort of the research in the field and what's happening in other states. But it does tend to be helpful. If you can move to the next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about the goals and powers. One of the things you want to make sure is that you've done a system review. Where are you right now? What are the issues with the current funding system? And JLARC has already done this for you. So you're sort of a step ahead of where a lot of other states are. The JLARC review of the funding formula helps you understand what some of the issues are and what some of the ways forward. So that's really good. It kind of gives you, a step up there. Then you've got to decide what's going to be on or off the table. And for instance, do you want to create a brand new formula or not? And so we heard a lot, at least in the last meeting I was in, that you're thinking of moving to a student-based formula away from your current system, which is we call a resource-based or teaching position-based formula. So you have to make that clear from the beginning that that is your goal then, that you'd like to change the entire formula and move away from your current system towards a student-based system. You also have to decide, are you going to have increases in funding implemented in the new formula? And if so, what are the levels of those increases? It's very important. Some states have decided they did not want to put extra money in. They just wanted a new formula system. I worked in Idaho for a couple of years where they did that. They said, we just want to change how we distribute money. We don't want to look at increases. Where Maryland looked at both changing their formula and deciding on do they need to increase the funding levels that they have. And then you have to decide what other issues may be on or off the table. We'll talk about that a bit more in another slide. We can go to the next slide, please. This, again, comes down to what kind of decisions are the commission going to make. Because this is a legislative commission, I'm going to guess that you're going to go towards having at the end, recommending a fully functioning model or brand new formula. In some cases, commissions just make general recommendations about, well, we should move towards this type of system, or target these types of student groups, and they don't make specific recommendations, sort of that 30,000-foot recommendation. But again, because this is you all have a primarily or a legislative commission, I would picture that you'd want to have much more detail, just like the discussion earlier on special education was not about generalizations about special education funding changes. They were about very specific funding changes for special education. And then you have to ask, is there going to be any area that you're not going to touch in your commission? A lot of states say, look, capital and transportation are funded in a very different way, and we're not going to focus in on that. We're going to focus in on our primary formula and leave the capital or transportation funding system to the side. Others decide to work with everything and put everything on the table. And then again, talked about this earlier, but are you going to change the funding levels? Are you going to look at things like state-local split? And are you even going to look at changing the way that you count students for funding purposes? In Delaware, they're looking at completely changing the way that they count their student population. Some of this has to do with sort of the post-COVID issues that happen, and others, they're just not happy with the way they currently count students for funding. So that is going to be on the table for them. We could go to the next slide, please. Time frame again, the bigger the changes, the longer it's going to take you to do it. A year is pretty ambitious in all honesty. Probably something closer to 18 months to 2 years if you're looking at making a major overhaul or adopting a brand new system. And it can take up to 3 years. Again, it depends where you're at. You have a bit of a head start because of the JLARC study, so you probably wouldn't be in the 3-year range, but thinking of the year to 2-year range is probably where it's going to be at. You could go to the next slide, please. And membership. Right now, your commission is made up of legislators. A lot of these different commissions include more people than that on their commissions. The more people you have, the more voices you get to hear. But if it becomes too large, it becomes unmanageable. So we saw most of these in the successful states were in the 20s. Some states just have legislators. Others have a combination of legislators and others, but in certain cases, they have those people as ex officio, so non-voting members of their commission. So you'd have the legislators who could vote, but you'd have others there providing their voice on the commission, where still others allow both legislators and non-voting, or legislators and non-legislators to have votes. So in Delaware, the commission is made up of about 30 members, about 6 or 7 are legislators, a couple from the governor's office, a couple from different groups like the Teachers Union, the Superintendents Association, and others. All of them have an equal vote on the commission. We could go to the next slide, please. So here are some things, and I think I talked about these in my last presentation, but I think it's really good to talk to people about that you want to put people at ease out there. They get very nervous in school districts, and both parents and educators and administrators when they hear the new formula is coming. So you want to let them know that you're putting some safeguards there to make sure that you're not going to jump in this all at once. You're not going to do something that will overly impact school districts. So you want to talk about that you're slowly maybe going to phase the formula in, that you're going to hold school districts harmless, that none of them would lose money from year to year as you slowly phase this in. Mississippi did this where they took they're taking 3 years now to hold everybody harmless, to let them get used to the new formula and phase it in. And then you want to also let people know what kind of mandates or programs you're still going to retain and you're not going to touch, so that will not be affected by any major formula change. And then finally, once you decided on the formula and started moving it towards adopting it, you want to train the public and staff in school districts about the new formula. So you want to have kind of open meetings where you talk to people in the community about what the new formula is and how is it different. But you also want to make sure you have real thorough training for your district staff so they understand what the new formula is, how it differs from the old one, and how that could impact their school districts. We go to the final slide, please. Thank you. So thank you, Madam Chair. That was my presentation. I'd be happy to answer questions or kind of walk you through some of our thoughts on these different things.
Thank you so much, Mr. Griffith, for that very insightful presentation. And if you don't mind, I would ask if anybody has any questions. Senator Boysko.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of the criteria that you brought up was how we count our students. And I happen to represent a community that has lots of students who come in and out, and they may stay for a few weeks or a year. It just changes, and it's very fluid. I'm wondering if you have experience with student populations like that, and how do they get fairly counted?
So, Senator, Madam Chair, There are a lot of ways that states do it. It's almost 50 different types of ways. But one of the things they've kind of focused on in the last couple decades is exactly what you're talking about. It used to be that you had a couple of count days at the beginning of the year, maybe a couple of count days at the end. And if students were there, then they got full funding. If they weren't, they didn't. A lot of states have moved to things like average daily attendance, where you count kids as the school year goes on. Others have, moved to what is called average daily membership. So you're not physically counting the kids, you're just saying they're on the school rolls for these times. So if a student were there, say, in the cases you talked about, 25% of the time, they would get at least 25% of funding. What you don't want really is a system where the student is there and they're not receiving any funding whatsoever. The other thing I'd say with that student population that we've seen is states have focused more on migrant students and talked about that those students have a high level of need. So especially in districts that have a disproportionate number of those kids, there are states that have migrant student funding that would help alleviate that also. So it's a student count issue, but it's also a special student population issue. Hope that was helpful.
Madam Chair, if I could just add to that, we use a average daily membership system that takes into account the average number of days. So it does pick up as student enrollment goes up and down throughout the school year.
Delegate Bolivar?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess I had a process question, and that is with the role of non-legislative members, because I saw that in your slide. They could be either voting or non-voting members, and would really appreciate kind of your insights on this. I remember a couple years ago we had I think it was an Education Innovation Commission that was put into place, and had this awkward provision where recommendations couldn't go forward unless there was a majority of legislators who were voting in favor of it. And I guess from my perspective, it had the impact of kind of quashing ownership and engagement from those non-legislative participants. And at the same time, given that we're going to have to take ownership of actually implementing the changes, I think that legislative buy-in is absolutely critical. But I'm curious how other states have navigated that, with respect to the role and participation of your non-legislative members.
Good question. Thank you, Madam Chair, Delegate. So it is one of those issues of trust, in all honesty. And so when you look at a state like Maryland, the majority of people on that commission were not legislators. They were from advocacy groups, other state organizations, but they worked well as a group. One of the things you can do to ensure that you're working well with this group is that the legislature appoints these people from the advocacy organizations. So within legislation, if you're going to create your commission through legislation, you would put on there that someone representing school districts is appointed by the legislature to be on there. So you would have sort of a connection there. But it becomes difficult. That's an interesting kind of situation you're talking about, that the commission could be overwhelmingly for something, but it doesn't pass because you don't have a majority of legislators. Usually these commissions just have a single vote, and so everyone is equal. But that's where, if that kind of worries you, you could move to the ex officio situation, where the people attend the meetings, they have their voice and they can be heard, but in the end, they don't vote on the final recommendations.
Madam Chair.
Delegate Rasul?
Madam Chair, my question is, and it might even be for Delegate Bulova, but anyone else who's on the early childhood work group that we have, that I believe has a system in place to bring in some outside voices. Love to hear kind of how that's structured, and maybe in moving forward we can be thinking about modeling off of some of that. Maybe Delegate Bulova or anyone else also can opine.
Madam Chair.
Delegate Bolivar?
Yeah, Madam Chair, and you could speak just as well to this as myself, given that we've had the fortune to be able to work on this commission together for the last couple of months. But I guess, to Delegate Rasul's point, we do have a model out there that seems to have worked relatively well in the Early Childhood Care and Education Commission. And so it is that mix of legislators and non-legislators. And so the difference, I think, with respect to the process is that it does allow us to engage with and have the input of subject matter experts, and that's been very, very helpful. But I think the other thing is I think, Madam Chair, as you know, and everybody here knows, it's really hard to have an in-depth conversation sitting around a dais. And so the way it's structured is kind of a focus group or work group process where you all sit in on the same presentations, you gather the information, and then you break out into work groups. You have an opportunity to really dive into the issues, ask lots of good questions. You report out kind of what those questions were, what findings are, what interests are, and that generates the next level of research and feedback. And so I think the beauty of it is that it's been a very iterative process that helps to guide what data is needed and then the policy outcomes. But I just wanted to put that out there because we do have a model that very well may serve at least as a starting point for what we might want to put together for the next steps of this process.
And if I might add, that's a model that allows for some very engaging dialogue among the members of that group, of that commission, because it allows, as you mentioned, for the work group to break out into those smaller groups, to have a discussion on the same topic, but then to be able to come together at the end of that particular topic and kind of report out what everybody has had an opportunity to talk about, and then come to some consensus on that issue. And at the end of the day, be able to have a report on what is that everybody agrees to. So I think, as Delegate Bulliver said, we do have a model that we could go by. Other discussions or questions to Mr. Griffith? If not, thank you so much, Mr. Griffith, for your insight as we continue this process, and we thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Please let me know if you have any other questions. I'd be happy to answer them. My email is griffith@learningpolicyinstitute.org. Your staff have that, and so please let me know if I can be of further help.
Okay, thank you so much. I will now ask staff to present us with our next steps. Delegate Rasul.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the staff and everyone putting the information together. And just to kind of reiterate, I believe we were on the same page coming out of the last meeting that we made some changes to the short-term recommendations through the budget in at-risk and ELL. And so these would be, from a policy perspective, in any kind of bill or omnibus bills that are going forward on top of the 624 and Senate Bill, I think 105, that both passed the House and Senate. as we move forward. That'd be correct, Zach?
Yes, I believe there were one or two other pieces that were in that bill that came from the JLARC report, the special education funding or staffing study directive, as well as, I'm blanking here. Oh, there was expanded, that the bill also included some expanded funding for national board certified teachers.
Thank you.
Does that complete your list?
It does.
Delegate Bolivar?
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think these next steps make a lot of sense. You know, I had flagged process of elimination. Being able to make a dent in and/or eliminate that support cap, I think would go a long way. That was the one thing we did back during the Great Recession, where we essentially unloaded all that cost responsibility on our local school districts. And so I think that would send a very strong message that we're serious about this effort. I guess I just want to make sure I understood you correctly and refreshing my memory, because I had mentioned whether we needed additional budget in order to be able to run those calculations to figure out what the cost impacts are of the other recommendations. And I guess from what you said, the money is already there. We just need to pull the trigger on what to ask for.
That's accurate, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions, comments? Okay, thank you, Zach. Delegate Bolivar?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And I guess building on that last conversation about how to kind of structure our work moving forward, can you remind me of kind of how long the charge is for the joint subcommittee? And if we wanted to incorporate something that was more work group like or focus group like, right? So this probably is an important part, right? So I kind of think of it as you got formal city council meetings, and then you got your work sessions, you know, where you roll up your sleeves and you have some more back and forth. But can you remind us of how long the joint subcommittee goes and how we might be able to effectuate, you know, having a little bit more of a work group model, you know, that we be part of this process?
Yes, the budget language that established this joint subcommittee, it actually was already in the budget, and we just added the task to look at the JLARC recommendations. The only time restriction was to get the report, the interim report done November 1st, which you have accomplished. So you do still have the authority to review K-12 funding, but there's not a specific task that the legislature has assigned or a specific deadline at this point.
I guess to add on to what Delegate Bolivar was asking, how would we get to something or a group like what Mr. Griffith was talking about? How do we get to something like that?
I think those are some discussions that we could have as we move towards session about what kind of, will we need some expertise to come in from outside to help facilitate some groups like that, or do we have that ability within in-house? I think that would be a first step, and then also providing some specific directions or goals for the coming from the legislature for the interim session in 2025.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you.
So at this time, we will open the floor up for public comment. As a reminder, we also have a written public comment form available now through December 13th. We will begin with individuals who signed up in advance to speak, and then I will ask if there's anyone else in the room who wishes to provide comments. As a reminder, the online public comment will remain available until the end of Friday, December 13th, using the link that's provided in the agenda. We will begin with, I believe, is Gary Curry from Rappahannock, the Rappahannock County Administrator.
Madam Chair, members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for the work you're doing. It's very important. We've been working with the current formulas for a long time, and they work great for many communities, not so much for ours, and we appreciate that you're putting the hard work in to figure figure it out for everybody. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. I also have, is it Mike Asip? Virginia Council of Administrators of Special Education.
Good morning. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the committee, subcommittee. I really appreciate and want to thank you for studying our special education and having a presentation today for additional funding as part of the SOQ funding reform. We know that JLARC in 2023 noted significant gaps in the funding that our students receive and the funding that they should receive. I believe the quote was $500 million per annum. The gap that Delegate Rasul pointed out in terms of percentage, the localities are bearing the burden, and I call it a burden only because it's not a burden in a true sense, but it is the cost, the majority of the costs for our students with disabilities when federal funding has failed. And over the last 10 years, our state's funding has declined by 16% as a share. The needs still remain. We have staff needs that are not being met, retention needs that Senator Boysko brought up that are real critical. I just spoke to a superintendent this week. One of their top teachers just resigned, burned out in the beginning of the year. There are folks really working hard to provide inclusive experiences for our students in challenging situations and behavior in the schools. Staff are burning out. There's also concerns around dispute resolution and the fact that not only does it cost students their achievement, but the costs are added on because parents are disagreeing with school staff on services, and it's increasing dispute resolution concerns. The student achievement gaps continue. Those have remained pretty consistent over the years, while funding has declined. Graduation concerns and the concerns of transition of our students to adult tax-paying citizens is our goal, is very much challenged in the current environment. So, and we've had HB 1089 and Senate Bill 220, which have ramped up the accountability and the expectations for our teachers and our school principals and our general ed teachers, and not significant funding to support those services. So while we welcome the model that was presented to you, it does not reform the SOQ formula pertaining to students with disabilities that option 5 is included in the report. We appreciate it. We need every dollar we can to help support our teachers, to help support our students, and to help them grow in their achievement through their school careers. So we support this funding, and the needs are still there. We just appreciate your added concern around how the funding formula can systematically change versus we see an add-on. It's an add-on that can grow, we hope, but it's an add-on that is not adequate to make up the gaps that have grown in funding over the last decade. So appreciate your support for that, and thank you for your time in looking at special ed today.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else who wishes to speak before the subcommittee today?
Good afternoon, Chair Locke, Chair Rasul, and members of the Joint Subcommission. I'm Lauren Gilbert, Advantage Strategies, speaking today on behalf of Stafford County. Stafford County is one of the fastest growing localities in Virginia. In fact, the county has experienced decades of population growth and at the same time, K-12 student population growth. As Stafford has grown, the county has maintained its reputation as a great place to live, work, retire, and learn. One of the things that Stafford County is proudest of is drawing a significant number of military veterans to the county. In fact, 19.4% of the county's population is made up of veterans. Stafford wants to make sure that it continues to be a place where our military veterans can come to live, retire, and especially learn, and Stafford County is committed to protecting high-quality services. Stafford is concerned that the current calculation of the LCI does not account for the value of exempted real estate properties for disabled veterans in the county. Stafford currently provides almost $20 million annually in tax relief for 3,800 properties, which comprises 8% of its real estate tax base. The county forecasts this amount to grow to over $100 million in tax relief annually within the next 10 years. We respectfully ask that as you evaluate the LCI, you consider removing the value of the disabled veterans exempted taxes real estate property values from the LCI formula. True value of real estate property is weighted at 50% of the LCI formula, and by including these tax-exempted properties as part of this number, the state is including properties which localities cannot collect local taxes on and it's evaluated as part of their ability to pay. Put simply, the funds are not there, and in localities like Stafford, the number of exempted properties is growing annually, and this is endangering the services that they really value providing. While Stafford is not the only locality being impacted by this tax relief, they are facing the highest impact per capita. There are also 4 counties that have that provide relief in excess of over 4%. Stafford County is 8%. City of Hampton is at 4.32%. Prince George County is at 4.25%, and Isle of Wight County is at 4.04%. We ask that you consider this as you are considering the LCI. I would also be remiss that if I did not mention that Stafford County has the highest labor cost differential of any locality not receiving 100% COCA adjustment. In fact, Stafford County is more like Prince William County, which receives 100% of the cost to compete adjustment than it is of any of the localities that do not receive that. Stafford appreciates the adjustments for labor costs as a significant part of the JLARC report and the work that this joint subcommittee will do, and we look forward to being a resource for you at any point. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Others?
Yes, good afternoon, Madam Chair. My name is Jeremy Bennett, representing the Virginia Association of Counties, VACO, and also good afternoon, members of the committee. Just wanted to briefly say that we really appreciate the work that you're doing on this. The data clearly shows the need for reform for the system, and VACO stands by to assist you in your efforts moving forward. But our members appreciate it, and the feedback we're getting from them on your work is greatly appreciated. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We just have one more slide to provide an update on public comments. There were 6 comments received during the online public comment period for your October 31st meeting. Those were forwarded to each of you in early November. To date, no public comments have been received in the online portal for this particular meeting. And also at your last meeting, a request was made for more information in response to several of the comments that had been received related to additional funding for Rappahannock County, who the county administrator spoke earlier at public comment. So just a little bit of background on this issue. Back in 2010, Rappahannock County successfully sought legislation allowing it to use a neighboring jurisdiction's lower local composite index to calculate its basic aid. And that legislation was passed with a cap to ensure that this funding would not increase over time. Our review of the local finance data reveals that Rappahannock County has a 0.8 LCI, which is the highest. It's a capped LCI. It's one of the highest. It's the highest LCI that a locality can have, which signifies a robust local tax base. Another measure that we looked at is the fiscal stress index, which is published by the Commission on Local Government, and that index shows that the locality, as of 2022, is the 122nd least fiscally stressed locality out of 133 cities and counties. And that data shows, it's mirrored in all the major components of that index, which include the size of the tax base, utilization of the tax base, and median household income. But we would note that JLARC's report included some longer-term actions that could benefit this locality, in particular, additional funding to recognize that smaller school divisions don't enjoy the same economies of scale that our larger school divisions do. And another recommendation that could provide additional resources to the school division was the recommendation to provide geographic adjustments to address higher costs of labor in different areas of the state.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, last call. Okay, thank you. As we close out 2024, I'd like to thank everyone for their participation in this joint subcommittee And I would like to take a moment to remind everyone that while we have some near-term actions that we could pursue in the 2025 session, the work does not end here. I am looking forward to progress in the 2025 session and to reconvening as a joint subcommittee in the 2025 interim. As mentioned in our first meeting, I plan to serve as chair for this year. When we meet again after the 2025 session, Delegate Rasul will serve as chair, and I will take over as vice chair. Delegate Rasul, do you want to provide any additional remarks?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Big shoes to fill. As we're thinking through education funding, be remiss not to mention, I think in recent years, we have, in a bipartisan way, made good investments in public education. We want to continue to explore how we can do right by our schools, our localities, and our students. As the landmark JLARC report mentioned last year, that our localities are paying $6 billion extra dollars that the state is not even accounting for into public education. And that is a heavy burden on our localities. And with the information that was presented today, we realized that $500 million of that extra is just put towards special education. So as we look forward to the 2025 session, we look forward to hopefully codifying the changes that we made in this past budget around the at-risk add-on and ELL, which won't cost us anymore, simply codifying that as we move forward. And then looking at the two top recommendations, which are trying to lift the support cap as much as possible, and also understanding just how far behind Virginia is in the country with regards to how we fund education for our students with disabilities, trying to see if we can make a significant dent there. And then as we move forward into the spring session, from a process perspective, exploring, as Madam Chair mentioned, the process that they employ at the Early Childhood Commission, which may be a little bit more of a process that will allow us to have more feedback and input from a variety of stakeholders as we go into next year and beyond. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Delegate Rasul, for your comments. And now I'd like to open it up to any member of the Joint Subcommittee who may have any comments that they'd like to share before we adjourn. Understanding that you stand between us and adjournment. If not, thank you everyone who attended here with us today, and all of you who provided presentations and public comment. Your insight has been invaluable to us and as we continue this process, and we know that we have a lot of work to do as we move forward, and we want to get this right. So we want to continue to ask you to continue with your input to us, and if there is no other business to come before us, the Joint Subcommittee will adjourn.
Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia.